World at 10. Let's get back to the top story, both with what's going on in Libya as well as the Middle East. Joining me with an expert perspective is Michael Crawford. Now, Michael Crawford served the British government in those regions in Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia for almost 30 years. He was also a visiting fellow and a consulting senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's now an independent consultant and writer, and he joins us with his perspective on what's going on in the region. Mr. Crawford, welcome to the show. Let me start first by getting your assessment on the UN decision to impose a no-fly zone. The reactions that we're seeing come into that from China, from Russia, and the general public reaction within Libya on those allied attacks. What do you make of all the events of the last 3-4 days?
Well, I think it's a very sudden decision, and possibly in the nick of time in terms of saving the civilian population in Benghazi and elsewhere. But there are big uncertainties about the purpose of the no-fly zone and what the end game is going to be. And I think there is a severe risk that this will end up in a stalemate, resulting in the no-fly zone having to be sustained for an enduring period. And that is something that none of those participating want to see.
Mr. Crawford, 2 points from that answer of yours. One of the key concerns of this allied attack seems to be the lack of clarity on what the objective is. Is taking Qaddafi out, for instance, the objective of this allied attack in the UN no-fly zone? You also mentioned that you expected this to be a prolonged conflict. Now, how long? What could the possible outcomes be?
Well, of course, it is possible that the no-fly zone would go on for several months. Indeed, in the case of Iraq, after the Gulf War in 1991, the no-fly zone went on for years. So, I mean, it is possible to see an enduring no-fly zone, but I very much doubt that countries participating with their own economic pressures and limited military resources, that they will want to do that. And so there is pressure to bring this to a conclusion, and there are various different outcomes that are possible. For instance, there might conceivably be regime change from within in Tripoli as a result of the pressures imposed by the no-fly zone, and realization by some within the regime that Qaddafi is in a sense a liability. That's possible. It's possible that the rebels may achieve some level of military success against the regime, although I think we can probably rule that out, because at present, and that is to say with the equipment that they currently have, I don't think they have the capacity to bring the regime down militarily. And then, of course, there is the possibility of the no-fly zone actually moving towards a regime change situation, and the regime being removed on that basis. And then finally, there is the eventuality of a stalemate in which the rebels continue to hold eastern Libya and the Qaddafi regime most of western Libya, with exceptions right on the west and in Misrata. So there are a number of outcomes which are possible there.
But Mr. Crawford, all of these outcomes are contingent on someone replacing Qaddafi, and that seems to be one of the key problems or challenges facing this UN action, and that is that there seems to be no alternative to Qaddafi, is there?
Well, obviously the issue as to who might succeed Qaddafi is a very open one. He's been in charge of government in Libya, although he has no official position, which people tend to forget. But he has no official position. He's been there for 40 years, and he has completely hollowed out most of the institutions in Libya. So there is no very obvious successor, and I think it would take time for a constituent assembly or whatever to materialize. So there would indeed be a hiatus in which perhaps those who are currently leading the rebellion from eastern Libya would assume temporary control, subject to, obviously, the establishment of procedures moving towards a new constitution a new form of government. But that's all a long way ahead, in a sense. And I think the fact that there is no obvious alternative gives Qaddafi a greater hold over his people. But we shouldn't forget, of course, there are a large number of Libyans in exile, many of them extremely well educated and so on, who could easily move back. And I think that would, if you like, transform the situation within the country.
When you say a long way ahead, Mr. Crawford, how long could that be? Can you estimate? I know it's a difficult question to answer, but the situation in Libya and across the Middle East has thrown commodity markets, specifically crude, into turmoil, and this is what markets are trying to anticipate. How long will this take to resolve itself?
I think this will be. It could last weeks, conceivably months. And I think this is going to be long drawn out, and I think that's going to be to nobody's advantage other than that of the Qaddafi regime. And therefore I think the chances of a restoration of Libyan oil supplies, for instance, will be slim in under 3, 4, 5, 6 months.
All right, that's going to continue to hurt crude prices. Now, let me turn your attention to the Middle East, to Yemen, Syria, Bahrain. And my question there is again the same. Isn't one of the key challenges to all the protests that are going on in those countries the fact that there seems to be no alternative to the monarchist, autocratic regimes that exist currently in those countries?
Well, I think we're seeing exactly the same grievances driving the protests and disturbances, resentment at encrusted patterns of power, lack of political participation, corruption, lack of jobs, and in a place like Yemen, increasing problems with natural resources, including lack of water. So it's no surprise, if you like, that these disturbances have been taking place in Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. And I think the country which is most at risk right now, or the government which is most at risk right now, is Yemen, because popular protests which have arisen in the last month or two and have been particularly, I think, threatening to the regime since Friday, when that massacre took place of protesters, and more than 40 were killed and hundreds wounded. In Yemen, you've had dissidents in the south, and we should remember this is a country which was only unified after 1990. It wasn't unified before that. So you've had dissidents in the south and a secessionist movement, you've had Al-Qaeda, and then you've had the Al-Houthi rebellion in the north. And I think what is significant there is that in the last few days, the support base of President Ali Abdullah Saleh in the Hashid Tribal Confederation and within the army, support base has started to dissipate, and people have come out against him who you would have thought would have remained supporters. And I think in all those countries where the government, the regime, has failed really to ensure that its support base is thoroughly on side, then the regime is extremely vulnerable.
Mr. Crawford, in fact, President Saleh has just offered to give up his post, but that has been rejected by the opposition. We've seen some of this trouble spread into the Saudi Arabia region as well, where the king had to give away several $1 billion in welfare benefits to try and quell the protests. So what implications do you think all of these protests, this unrest in the Middle East, is likely to have on regional stability, and therefore the sort of final outcome that we can expect from all of these protest movements?
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, we are in some places at the end of Act 1, if you like, of a 3-act play. In other cases, we haven't even got that far. So I think this is going to go on for an extended period. But I would just make 2 points. One is that it seems to me that economic reform has to be a victim of what's going on, because there is a problem around subsidies, which governments the last year or two have been trying to reduce because of the heavy burden on budgets. And now, of course, with these handouts, actually subsidies are being increased again, so that's imposing a fiscal burden on states. Of course, some of them, the oil-rich Gulf states, they can carry that burden, but nonetheless, it's a heavy fiscal burden, and it's not clear to me in the time ahead, bearing in mind the demographics of these countries, how economic growth will be achieved, which will which need to be between 6 and 9%, which if will keep pace with the growing population. And meantime, it seems to me partly because of the popular movements, the disturbances, the uncertainty, the risk and so on, as well as the fiscal burden, I think it's inevitable that the oil price will remain pretty high. So that's an inescapable consequence, I think, of what is going on. And I think it's not just Libya, it's Bahrain, and a sense that the whole region has started to enter a period of turmoil which will last a considerable period.
All right, Michael Crawford, it is going to get worse before it gets better. Thank you.